Hi friends, welcome back to Talevora. Today, we're going to step into the life of a man whose curiosity seemed to have no limits. He painted one of the most famous faces in history, but painting was only a small part of what fascinated him. He studied nature, the human body, machines, flight, water, and almost everything around him. His name was Leonardo da Vinci, and this is the story of the extraordinary man behind the legend. Leonardo da Vinci was born on April 15, 1452, near the small Tuscan town of Vinci in Italy. At the time, nobody looking at that little boy could have imagined that his name would one day become almost synonymous with genius. His childhood was far removed from the world of fame that would eventually surround him. Leonardo grew up in the countryside, surrounded by hills, fields, streams, animals, and the changing seasons of nature. And those surroundings would leave a deep impression on him. Leonardo was curious about almost everything he saw. A bird flying across the sky could make him wonder how flight worked. Moving water could make him stop and observe its direction. A strange plant could become something worth studying. Even the human face could become a mystery he wanted to understand. He did not simply want to look at the world. He wanted to understand it. That habit would stay with him for the rest of his life. As Leonardo grew older, his path eventually took him to Florence, one of the most important centers of art and culture in Renaissance Italy. Florence was filled with artists, craftsmen, architects, merchants, scholars, and wealthy families who supported ambitious creative work. For a young man with Leonardo's curiosity, it was an extraordinary place to be. As a teenager, Leonardo entered the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio. This was not simply a place where young artists learned how to paint. The workshop exposed them to sculpture, drawing, engineering, metalwork, architecture, and many other practical skills. Leonardo was entering a world where art and science were not separated in the way we often think about them today. He learned by watching. He learned by drawing. He learned by experimenting. And perhaps most importantly, he learned by asking questions. Leonardo's drawings from these early years already showed that his interests went far beyond ordinary painting. He studied landscapes, human figures, animals, machines, water, and the effects of light and shadow. For Leonardo, drawing was not just about making something beautiful. It was a way of investigating reality. If he wanted to understand a hand, he wanted to know what was underneath the skin. If he wanted to draw a bird, he wanted to understand the movement of its wings. If he wanted to paint water, he wanted to understand how it moved. His mind seemed to move constantly from one question to another, and that became both his greatest strength and one of the biggest complications of his life. Leonardo could become fascinated by an idea so completely that he wanted to investigate every detail of it. He could begin with a simple observation and end up exploring an entirely different subject. A question about birds could lead to the mechanics of flight. A question about the human body could lead to anatomy. A question about movement could lead to machines. Everything seemed connected in his mind. One of the earliest surviving examples of this way of thinking is his famous landscape drawing of the Arno Valley, dated 1473. Instead of simply creating an imaginary landscape, Leonardo carefully observed the natural world around him. It was a sign of something that would become central to his life. He trusted observation. He wanted to see things for himself, and he wanted to understand what was actually happening rather than simply accepting what other people believed. This attitude made him unusual, but it also meant that Leonardo was rarely satisfied with simple answers. The more he learned, the more questions he discovered, and the more questions he discovered, the more he he wanted to explore. By this point, Leonardo was developing the skills that could have made him a successful artist. But success was not enough for him. He wanted to know more. He wanted to explore more. He wanted to understand more. And slowly, something became clear about the way Leonardo's mind worked. He was not interested in being only one thing. He did not want to be known simply as a painter. He was fascinated by nature, mathematics, anatomy, architecture, engineering, music, and the movement of the physical world. In his notebooks, he would eventually fill page after page with observations, sketches, questions, calculations, and ideas. Some ideas were practical, some were experimental, some were far ahead of their time, and many were never completed. This would become one of the great mysteries surrounding Leonardo. How could a man with so much talent leave so many things unfinished? Part of the answer was that Leonardo was constantly searching for something deeper. He did not seem satisfied with simply producing an object. He wanted to understand the process behind it. He could spend enormous amounts of time observing a subject before deciding exactly how he wanted to represent it. For him, the journey mattered as much as the final result. But while Leonardo was developing his extraordinary abilities, Renaissance Italy was also changing around him. Powerful families competed for influence. Wealthy patrons searched for talented artists. Cities wanted impressive buildings, paintings, sculptures, and public projects, and artists who could offer something different had opportunities to rise. Leonardo was about to discover that talent alone was not enough. He would need patrons, he would need opportunities, and he would need to convince powerful people that his unusual abilities were worth their attention. Florence had given him his education, but Leonardo's ambitions were beginning to reach beyond Florence. There was a much larger world waiting for him, and eventually, that world would take him to Milan. Before that happened, however, Leonardo would face one of the most important decisions of his early life. He would have to decide what kind of man he wanted to become: an artist, an engineer, an inventor, a scientist, or something that had never really existed before. Leonardo did not choose just one. He chose curiosity itself, and that decision would shape everything that came next. Leonardo's journey was about to take him far beyond Florence. In 1482, he moved to Milan and entered the service of Ludovico Sforza, the powerful ruler of the city. Leonardo was looking for an opportunity to use his talents, but what he offered was much more than a simple painting. In a remarkable letter to Ludovico, Leonardo presented himself as someone capable of designing bridges, weapons, military machines, buildings, and other engineering projects. Only later did he mention his ability as a painter and sculptor. It was almost as if Leonardo wanted the world to understand that he was much more than an artist. Milan gave him the freedom to explore that wider identity. He worked on paintings, he studied architecture, he designed machines, he investigated human anatomy, he observed water, he studied the movement of birds, and he continued filling his notebooks with ideas. One of his most ambitious projects was a huge equestrian monument dedicated to Francesco Sforza, Ludovico's father. Leonardo imagined an enormous horse sculpture that would become one of the greatest monuments of its time. He spent years thinking about the design. He studied horses carefully. He made drawings. He considered the structure and the enormous amount of material that would be required. Eventually, Leonardo created a large clay model of the horse. For a moment, his dream seemed close to becoming reality. But then history interfered. War was approaching, and the bronze that had been intended for Leonardo's monument was needed for weapons instead. The enormous sculpture was never completed in bronze. Leonardo's great horse disappeared before it could become the masterpiece he had imagined. But this was becoming a pattern in his life. Leonardo could imagine things on a scale that was difficult to complete. He would dream of enormous projects, investigate them deeply, and sometimes leave them unfinished when circumstances changed or another question captured his attention. Yet his notebooks continued to grow. Page after page contained drawings of machines, studies of anatomy, observations of nature, mathematical calculations, and strange mechanical ideas. Some of these designs looked almost like inventions from a much later age. He imagined flying machines. He studied parachute-like designs. He explored mechanical devices. He examined weapons and defensive structures. But Leonardo was not simply drawing machines because he wanted to build them. He wanted to understand the principles behind them. Flight fascinated him because birds could do something humans could not. They could rise into the air without wings attached to their bodies. Leonardo carefully studied birds and their wings, trying to understand how air and movement interacted. He believed that if he could understand nature, perhaps humans could learn from it. This idea appeared again and again throughout his life. Nature was his teacher, but perhaps the most remarkable part of Leonardo's curiosity was his interest in the human body. He wanted to know what was happening beneath the surface. He studied bones, muscles, organs, veins, and the structure of the human body through anatomical investigations. His drawings became extraordinarily detailed. He was not simply trying to make the human figure look realistic. He wanted to understand why it looked the way it did. This knowledge would later influence the way he painted people. A face was no longer simply a collection of lines and shadows. It was a living structure. A smile was not just a curve. It was the movement of muscles. A hand was not just something to draw. It was a complicated arrangement of bones, joints, tendons, and muscles. Leonardo's curiosity transformed the way he approached art. And then came one of the paintings that would eventually become one of the most famous artworks in human history, The Last Supper. Leonardo created it in Milan for the refectory of the Dominican convent of Santa Maria del Grazie. The scene showed Jesus and his disciples at the moment when Jesus announced that one of them would betray him. But Leonardo did not want the figures to look frozen. He wanted the scene to feel alive. Each disciple reacts differently. Some look shocked. Some question what they have heard. Some turn toward others. Their hands, faces, and bodies create a sense of movement across the entire scene. Leonardo was trying to capture emotion itself, but there was a serious problem. His experimental technique was not durable. The painting began deteriorating relatively quickly. Leonardo had been searching for a new way to work, but the experiment came at a cost. The masterpiece survived, but it would require generations of restoration. Even so, The Last Supper showed what made Leonardo different. He was not satisfied with simply reproducing a scene. He wanted to capture a moment of human emotion. He wanted the viewer to feel what was happening. And then there was another painting, a small portrait that would eventually become perhaps the most famous painting on earth. The woman was Lisa Gherardini, traditionally identified as the subject of the Mona Lisa. Leonardo worked on the painting for years. He studied her expression. He refined the transitions between light and shadow. He carefully softened the edges of the face. Her expression became strangely difficult to define. Was she smiling? Was she simply calm? Was there something hidden in her expression? That uncertainty became part of the painting's power. Leonardo had discovered that sometimes the less certain an expression was, the the more the viewer wanted to understand it. But even as he worked on famous paintings, Leonardo's mind remained restless. He continued studying. He continued drawing. He continued experimenting. His notebooks became a private world where he could move freely between subjects. One page could contain anatomy. Another could contain a machine. Another could contain a study of water. Another could contain a face. He did not seem to believe that knowledge belonged inside separate boxes. Everything was connected. This way of thinking was extraordinary, but it also made Leonardo's life complicated. He often struggled to finish projects. Some commissions were delayed. Some were abandoned. Some existed only as drawings and ideas. People could see his talent, but they could also become frustrated by his inability to work like an ordinary commissioned artist. Leonardo needed time. He needed freedom. And most of all, he needed curiosity. But the world around him did not always give him those things. Politics changed. Wars changed the balance of power. Patrons disappeared. Cities changed hands. And Leonardo eventually left Milan. His life became a series of movements between cities, patrons, projects, and ideas. Yet wherever he went, he carried the same thing with him: his notebooks, his drawings, his questions, and his endless desire to understand the world. By now, Leonardo had become much more than a talented Florentine artist. He was becoming something much harder to define: an artist who thought like an engineer who observed like a scientist who imagined like an artist, and a man whose greatest masterpiece may not have been any single painting. It may have been the way he learned to look at the world. But Leonardo's story was far from finished. There were still years ahead of him. More paintings, more discoveries, more unfinished dreams, and one final journey that would take him away from Italy. Leonardo's final years were very different from the restless energy of his youth. He had already lived in Florence and Milan, created extraordinary works of art, filled countless pages with observations, and spent decades chasing questions that most people never even thought to ask. But his journey was not over yet. In the early 16th century, Leonardo returned to Florence for a period of time. The city had changed, and so had Leonardo. He was no longer simply the young artist searching for recognition. He was now a famous and respected master whose reputation had spread far beyond Italy. Yet fame did not make his curiosity disappear. He continued studying. He continued drawing. He continued observing. And he continued working on ideas that might never be finished. During this period, Leonardo became involved in a remarkable artistic rivalry. Michelangelo was another extraordinary artist working in Florence, and the two men represented very different personalities and approaches to art. Leonardo was older, experienced, and deeply experimental. Michelangelo was younger, intense, ambitious, and already developing a reputation of his own. Their rivalry became part of the cultural atmosphere of Renaissance Florence. Both artists were asked to create major paintings for the Hall of the 500 in the Palazzo Vecchio. Leonardo began working on a huge battle scene. He studied horses. He studied movement. He designed the composition carefully. But once again, the project did not reach the finished form that had been intended. Leonardo experimented with a new painting technique, and the result failed. The work was abandoned. Another extraordinary idea was left unfinished. For someone else, this might have been remembered as failure. For Leonardo, it became another chapter in a life filled with unfinished experiments. But something else was happening. Leonardo's reputation continued growing even when some of his projects remained incomplete. People were fascinated by his mind. He had become known for asking questions nobody else seemed to ask, and his notebooks became increasingly valuable records of his thinking. Leonardo wrote thousands of pages during his lifetime. lifetime. He recorded observations about anatomy, geology, water, plants, animals, architecture, machines, mathematics, and countless other subjects. Some drawings were beautiful, others were practical. Some were almost impossible to understand without studying the notes around them, but together they reveal something extraordinary. Leonardo was trying to build a map of the world inside his own mind. He wanted to understand how everything worked. He studied fossils and rocks. He wondered about the movement of water. He investigated the structure of plants. He observed the flight of birds. He examined the human body. He was constantly searching for patterns, and sometimes he seemed to think decades or even centuries ahead of his own time. But Leonardo's life was not only about brilliant ideas. There were also long periods of uncertainty. He had to depend on powerful patrons. Political situations changed. Wars affected cities. Commissions could disappear, and projects could take years longer than expected. Leonardo was not living in a world where an independent artist could simply work whenever he wanted. He needed support. He needed money, and he needed people willing to give him the freedom to explore. Eventually, that support came from an unexpected place: France. Leonardo accepted an invitation from King Francis I and moved to France near the end of his life. He settled at Clauselus near the royal residence at Amboise. By then, Leonardo was an elderly man. His physical strength was no longer what it had been, but his mind remained active. The French king admired him and treated him with great respect. Leonardo was given a comfortable residence and the freedom to continue his intellectual work. He brought some of his most important paintings with him. Among them was the Mona Lisa. Imagine the journey. The painting that would eventually become one of the most famous artworks in the world was carried with Leonardo as he entered the final chapter of his life. But even in old age, Leonardo continued thinking. He worked on architectural ideas. He studied nature. He revisited old drawings. He continued writing. He continued asking questions. Perhaps that is one of the most remarkable things about him. He never seemed to reach a point where he thought he knew enough. For most people, success eventually creates a desire to stop. Leonardo seemed to experience the opposite. The more he discovered, the more he realized how much he did not know. And perhaps that was why his notebooks became so important. They were not simply records of completed discoveries. They were records of a mind in motion. A mind that was constantly testing possibilities. A mind that could imagine something, draw it, question it, change it, and then move on to something else. Leonardo's final years were quieter than his younger life, but his curiosity remained. He continued discussing ideas with visitors. He continued working on his drawings. He continued studying the world around him. And eventually, his life began to reach its final chapter. Leonardo da Vinci died on May 2, 1519. At Clauselus in France. He was 67 years old. The man who had spent his entire life trying to understand the world was gone. But his ideas were not. His notebooks survived. His paintings survived. His drawings survived. And slowly, over the centuries, the world began to understand just how extraordinary his mind had been. The Mona Lisa became one of the most recognizable paintings on earth. The Last Supper became one of the most studied artworks in history. His anatomical drawings became extraordinary records of observation. His engineering sketches became symbols of imagination far ahead of their time. But perhaps Leonardo's greatest legacy is not a painting, an invention, or a notebook. It is a way of thinking. He looked at ordinary things and refused to accept that they were ordinary. He saw questions where other people saw answers. He saw possibilities where other people saw limitations. He looked at a bird and wondered about flight. He looked at water and wondered about movement. He looked at the human body and wanted to understand what was beneath the skin. He looked at a blank page and saw an entire world of possibilities. And that is why Leonardo da Vinci remains fascinating centuries after his death. His story reminds us that genius does not always begin with knowing the answers. Sometimes it begins with refusing to stop asking questions. Leonardo was not perfect. He left projects unfinished. He changed his mind. He became distracted. He sometimes struggled to complete the enormous visions he created. But perhaps those imperfections make his story even more human. He was not a machine producing masterpieces one after another. He was a person who was constantly searching, constantly experimenting, constantly learning, and constantly wondering what was beyond the next question. The boy from Vinci could never have known what his curiosity would eventually become. He could not have imagined that people hundreds of years later would still study his face, his paintings, his notebooks, and his ideas. He simply kept looking. He kept drawing. He kept asking. And that may be the most important lesson hidden inside his story. You do not always need to know exactly where your curiosity will take you. Sometimes you only need the courage to follow it. Leonardo da Vinci spent his life doing exactly that. And centuries later, the world is still following the trail he left behind. If you enjoyed this true story, subscribe to Talevora for more real stories about the world's most extraordinary personalities. Because behind every famous name, there is a human story. And sometimes, the most powerful story begins with something as simple as a question.